Alex Martinez was 16 years old and had been sleeping in his 10-year-old Honda Civic in the school parking lot for 3 weeks when his English teacher, Mr. Ramirez, had started noticing a pattern that had eventually led to a conversation that had changed Alex's entire life. And those 3 weeks of homelessness had been the result of a Sunday evening confrontation with his parents when Alex had finally admitted he was gay after months of his mother finding concerning things on his phone and his father making increasingly pointed comments about why Alex never talked about girls. And his parents, who were deeply religious conservative Catholics, had responded by telling Alex that he needed to leave their house immediately because they wouldn't have a homosexual living under their roof, corrupting his younger siblings and defying God's plan. And at 16 years old, Alex had found himself with a backpack of clothes in his car and nowhere to go and no family support and the overwhelming question of how he was going to finish high school while literally homeless. Alex had grown up in a working-class Latino family in suburban Seattle, had been raised in a strict Catholic household where church attendance was mandatory and traditional gender roles were enforced, and any deviation from heterosexual norms was treated as sinful and shameful. And he'd known he was gay since he was approximately 12 years old, but had hidden it carefully because he'd understood, even as a young teenager, that his parents would not accept it and that coming out would have severe consequences. He dated a girl briefly during freshman year to maintain appearances, had learned to monitor his speech and mannerisms to avoid seeming too feminine or raising suspicion, had deleted any evidence of his actual identity from his phone and social media, and had tried desperately to be the son his parents wanted, even though doing so had meant completely suppressing who he actually was. The suppression had become increasingly difficult as Alex had gotten older and had started understanding himself better, and had connected online with other LGBTQ+ youth who were living authentically, and had made him realize that hiding forever wasn't sustainable. And by age 16, the gap between his true self and the performance he maintained at home had become so painful that he'd started taking small risks like joining his high school's GSA, Gender and Sexuality Alliance, club, and being more open with trusted friends about his identity. And his mother had found text messages on his phone to another boy from the GSA that had made it clear Alex was gay. And she'd confronted him, and he'd been too tired of hiding to deny it anymore, and had confirmed yes, he was gay, and no, he wasn't going to change or pray it away or pretend to be someone he wasn't. His parents had reacted with a combination of anger and grief and religious conviction that what Alex was describing was a sin and a choice and something that could be fixed through prayer and discipline and possibly conversion therapy. And when Alex had refused to attend the church counseling his parents had arranged and had said clearly that he was gay and that wasn't going to change, they'd told him that he needed to leave because they couldn't in good conscience support a lifestyle that went against everything they believed, and they needed to protect his younger siblings from his influence. Alex had tried to argue that he was 16, and legally they couldn't just kick him out, and where exactly did they expect him to go? And his father had said that Alex had made his choice and choices had consequences, and he could go live with whatever people supported his lifestyle because he wasn't welcome in their home anymore. Alex had packed what he could fit in his backpack and had left that Sunday evening and had driven to a friend's house and had explained the situation and had asked if he could stay there temporarily. But his friend's parents had been sympathetic but had said they couldn't take in someone else's minor child without parental permission and without going through proper legal channels, and they were worried about liability and about what Alex's parents might do if they found out, and Alex had understood but had felt the reality sinking in that he had nowhere to go because most of his friends lived with parents who would have similar concerns about housing someone else's teenager without permission. He'd spent that first night sleeping in his car in a Walmart parking lot, had reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go, and had tried to sleep with a jacket as a blanket, and had felt frightened and alone, and had cried quietly in the dark, wondering how his life had gone from relatively normal teenager to homeless in the space of a few hours. Over the following days, he'd developed a routine out of necessity. He'd sleep in his car in various parking lots, trying not to stay in the same location too many nights in a row to avoid attracting attention. He'd shower at the YMCA, where he had a membership he'd gotten for swimming team. He'd do homework at McDonald's or the public library, where he could charge his phone and laptop. And he'd go to school every day because school was the one place that felt normal and structured and where he could pretend everything was fine. The school parking lot had become his primary sleeping location because it felt safer than random parking lots, and because he needed to be at school anyway, so it made sense to just arrive very early and park in a corner spot and sleep there until classes started. And he'd been doing this for 3 weeks, managing to hide his homelessness from everyone by arriving before any other students and leaving late after most people had gone, and maintaining his normal appearance and academic performance. Despite sleeping in a car and having essentially no money for food beyond what the school cafeteria provided for students on free lunch programs. What Alex hadn't realized was that his English teacher, Mr. Ramirez, arrived at school very early every morning to prepare for classes and grade papers in the quiet hours before students arrived. And Mr. Ramirez had noticed over several weeks that there was always one car in the parking lot when he arrived at 6:30 a.m., always the same older Honda Civic. And he'd eventually realized that there was someone sleeping in the driver's seat, and after observing this pattern for a week, he'd approached the car one morning and had recognized Alex Martinez, one of his junior year students who was a strong writer and a thoughtful contributor to class discussions, but who'd seemed increasingly tired and distracted over the past few weeks. Mr. Ramirez, whose full name was David Ramirez, was 42 years old and had been teaching high school English for 15 years. And he was a gay man who'd come out during college and who'd experienced his own share of family rejection and struggled before eventually building a life with his husband Marco, who was a social worker. And when David had seen Alex sleeping in the car in the school parking lot, he'd immediately suspected what might be happening because he knew the statistics about LGBTQ plus youth homelessness and knew that family rejection was the leading cause, and knew that Alex had recently become more active in the school's GSA, which often meant students were coming out and sometimes facing consequences at home. David had knocked gently on the car window, and Alex had woken with the startled, hyper-vigilant reaction of someone who'd learned to sleep ready for potential danger. And David had stepped back with his hands visible and had asked through the glass if Alex was okay and if they could talk for a few minutes. Alex had gotten out of the car reluctantly and had stood there in the cold morning air wearing the same clothes he'd slept in and had waited for whatever was coming. A lecture about not being allowed to sleep on school property, maybe being reported to administration or security, maybe having his parents called, which was the last thing he wanted. But David had asked simply and directly whether Alex had a safe place to sleep, and when Alex had hesitated and then admitted no, not really, he'd been sleeping in his car for a few weeks, David had asked why, and Alex had said because his parents had kicked him out, and David had asked if it was okay to ask why they'd kicked him out, and Alex had said quietly it was because he was gay. David had nodded like this was exactly what he'd suspected, and had asked if Alex would be willing to meet with him and the school counselor during first period to discuss options, because sleeping in a car at 16 years old was not sustainable, and there were resources and possibilities that might help. Alex had met with David and the school counselor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd been understanding and professional, and had explained that they were mandatory reporters, which meant they were legally required to report the situation to Child Protective Services, because Alex was a minor who'd been kicked out by his parents and was homeless, but that they'd also work with Alex to try to find the best possible outcome, which ideally would be family reunification with support services, but might also include foster care placement if returning home wasn't safe or possible. Alex had felt panicked about CPS involvement because he'd heard horror stories about the foster system and didn't want to be placed with strangers, and was worried that being in the system would somehow be worse than sleeping in his car, where at least he had independence and could keep going to school with his friends. David had told Alex that before they made any official reports they wanted to explore another option, and he'd asked Alex if he'd be willing to meet with David and his husband Marco to discuss a possible arrangement, and Alex had been confused but had agreed. That afternoon, David and his husband Marco had met with Alex in a private conference room at the school and had explained that they'd been discussing the situation and had decided they wanted to offer Alex their spare bedroom for as long as he needed it. That they understood this was an unusual arrangement and would need to be done properly through legal channels, but that they were willing to pursue emergency foster placement if Alex was interested, and that as a gay couple who'd both experienced family rejection when they were younger, they understood something about what Alex was going through and wanted to offer him a safe, stable place to live while he finished high school. Alex had been overwhelmed and skeptical and hadn't understood why two adults he barely knew would offer to take him in. And Marco, who was a social worker with experience in LGBTQ plus youth services, had explained gently that approximately 40% of homeless youth identified as LGBTQ+, even though they made up only 7% of the general youth population. That family rejection was the #1 cause of LGBTQ+ youth homelessness, that homeless LGBTQ+ youth faced extremely high rates of violence and exploitation and mental health crises, and that Marco and David had both been fortunate to survive their own coming-out experiences and had always wanted to help other young people who were facing similar struggles. And this seemed like an opportunity to actually make a concrete difference rather than just talking about the problem. The process of arranging emergency foster placement had taken 2 weeks of paperwork and home inspections and background checks and meetings with social workers and family court. And during those 2 weeks, Alex had continued sleeping in his car, while David and Marco had worked with their attorney and with CPS and with Alex's school counselor to expedite the placement process. Alex's parents had been contacted by CPS and had been asked whether they wanted Alex to return home and whether they'd be willing to participate in family counseling. And they'd said no. They'd made their position clear that they couldn't support Alex's lifestyle, and they thought it would be best if he lived elsewhere. And while their refusal had been painful for Alex to hear, it had also made the foster placement legally simpler because there was no custody dispute. 2 weeks after that initial parking lot conversation, Alex had moved into David and Marco's house, which was a comfortable 3-bedroom home in a neighborhood 15 minutes from Alex's high school. And they'd given him the upstairs bedroom that they'd been using as a home office and had helped him move his few possessions from his car and had taken him shopping for clothes and school supplies and basic necessities that he'd been lacking while homeless. The first night sleeping in an actual bed in a warm, safe house after 3 weeks of sleeping in a car had been overwhelming enough that Alex had cried in his room, trying to process that this was real and that these 2 men who owed him nothing had chosen to help him. The adjustment to living with David and Marco had been strange initially because Alex had never lived with openly gay adults and had never been in a household where being LGBTQ+ was treated as completely normal and unremarkable. And it had been surreal to sit at dinner table conversations where David and Marco talked about their day and their work and asked about Alex's classes and homework with the same mundane family dynamics that Alex remembered from before everything had fallen apart, except without the constant underlying tension about hiding who he was or monitoring his behavior to avoid suspicion. David and Marco had established clear house rules and expectations. Alex needed to maintain his grades and attend school regularly and let them know where he was going and when he'd be home and contribute to household chores and be respectful. Basically the same rules any parents would establish. But they'd also made clear that they accepted Alex completely as he was and that their home was a safe space where he didn't need to hide or perform or pretend to be someone different. They'd also connected Alex with a therapist who specialized in LGBTQ+ youth issues to help him process the trauma of family rejection and homelessness, and they'd encouraged him to stay connected with the school's GSA and to build community with other LGBTQ+ peers. 3 months after moving in with David and Marco, Alex's academic performance had improved dramatically after the brief decline during his homelessness period. And his GPA, which had dropped from 3.4 to 2.8 during the weeks he'd been sleeping in his car, had rebounded to 4.0 as he'd caught up on assignments and had been able to focus on schoolwork instead of on survival logistics. His teachers had noticed the change, and several had commented to David that Alex seemed happier and more engaged and was producing some of the strongest work in his classes, and David had felt grateful that the stability they provided was allowing Alex's actual capabilities and potential to emerge now that he wasn't spending all his energy on just surviving. 6 months after placement, the family court had converted Alex's emergency foster placement to a long-term arrangement that would last until he aged out of the foster system at 18. And while the formal legal relationship was foster care rather than adoption, David and Marco had told Alex that they considered him family and that he'd always have a place in their home regardless of what the legal paperwork said. Alex had started calling them David and Marco rather than Mr. Ramirez and Mr. Herrera, and had gradually begun to feel like this was actually his home rather than temporary housing, had personalized his room with posters and books, and had invited friends over, and had started to rebuild some sense of normalcy and belonging. Alex had maintained minimal contact with his biological parents through occasional text messages, mostly around holidays or his birthday, and his parents had sent brief messages saying they loved him and were praying for him, but their position hadn't changed about not being able to support his lifestyle. And Alex had come to accept that his relationship with his parents might never be repaired and that he needed to build his own chosen family with people who accepted him completely. He'd stayed connected with his younger siblings through secret social media contact and had hoped that maybe someday when they were older and more independent, they might be able to have relationships separate from their parents' beliefs. 1 year after moving in with David and Marco, Alex had applied to colleges with their support and guidance and had written his personal statement essay about his experience of coming out in homelessness and finding stability with his foster parents. And he'd been accepted to the University of Washington with a combination of merit scholarships and financial aid that would cover most of his costs. David and Marco had been intensely proud and had told Alex that watching him not just survive, but thrive despite everything he'd been through had been one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives. And they'd meant what they'd said about him always having a home with them, and they expected him to come back during college breaks and summers unless he had better plans. Alex had graduated high school with a 3.9 cumulative GPA despite the rough semester during his homelessness, had been accepted to University of Washington's social work program, where he decided to study because his experience with Marco and with his own therapist had shown him that social work could make concrete differences in people's lives. And he'd specifically wanted to work with LGBTQ+ youth who were experiencing homelessness or family rejection because he understood exactly what they were going through and wanted to help others the way Marco and David had helped him. During college, Alex had become involved in LGBTQ+ youth advocacy work and had volunteered at a drop-in center for homeless LGBTQ+ youth in Seattle and had shared his story at various events and conferences about LGBTQ+ youth homelessness. And he'd been struck by how common his experience was. Countless teenagers kicked out by parents for being gay or trans, sleeping in cars or on couches or on the streets, trying to finish high school while managing survival, facing violence and exploitation, and mental health crises at rates far higher than their straight peers. The statistics had told a clear story about systemic failure to protect LGBTQ+ young people from family rejection and about the desperate need for more affirming foster families and more resources specifically designed for this population. 2 years into college, Alex had been asked to testify at a state legislature hearing about LGBTQ+ youth homelessness and the need for foster parent recruitment focused on LGBTQ+ affirming households. And he told his story about being kicked out at 16 and sleeping in his car in the school parking lot and being taken in by his gay English teacher and his teacher's husband. And he'd explained that having foster parents who understood and accepted his identity had been transformative, not just in terms of having housing, but in terms of having adults who modeled that being gay wasn't shameful or broken, and that he deserved the same safety and support that any teenager deserved. Several legislators had been visibly moved, and the testimony had contributed to legislation that established targeted recruitment for LGBTQ+ affirming foster parents and increased funding for LGBTQ+ youth services. For years after moving in with David and Marco, Alex had graduated from University of Washington with his social work degree and had been hired by the same drop-in center where he'd volunteered, working specifically with homeless LGBTQ+ youth to connect them with housing and counseling and educational support and family mediation when appropriate. And he'd brought his own lived experience to the work in ways that built immediate trust and credibility with the young people he served because they knew he wasn't speaking theoretically about homelessness or family rejection, but was speaking from direct knowledge of what it felt like to sleep in a car at 16 and wonder if your parents would ever accept you. Alex Martinez's story reminds us that he was 16 years old and had been sleeping in his Honda Civic in the school parking lot for 3 weeks after his parents kicked him out for being gay. And he would probably have continued sleeping there and struggling alone if his English teacher, Mr. Ramirez, hadn't noticed that Alex's car was always the first one in the parking lot every morning and hadn't recognized that pattern as potential homelessness and hadn't approached Alex and offered him his husband's spare bedroom. And that offer had transformed Alex's life from homeless and failing to stable and thriving with a 4.0 GPA and eventually graduating college and becoming a social worker helping other LGBTQ+ homeless youth. LGBTQ+ youth are 40% of homeless youth despite being only 7% of the general youth population. Family rejection is the #1 cause. Alex's parents were religious conservatives who told him homosexuality was a sin and kicked him out to protect his younger siblings. He was 16, legally a minor his parents couldn't just abandon, but they did anyway. 3 weeks sleeping in his car, showering at the YMCA, doing homework at McDonald's, pretending everything was fine at school. His teacher David Ramirez noticed Alex's car always there at 6:30 a.m., approached him, asked if he had safe housing. Alex admitted he'd been kicked out for being gay. David was a gay man himself, knew these statistics, understood family rejection. He and his husband Marco, a social worker specializing in LGBTQ+ youth, offered Alex their spare bedroom. Emergency foster placement processed in 2 weeks. Alex moved in. 3 months later, Alex's GPA went from 2.8 during homelessness to 4.0 with stability. Having a bed, regular meals, adults who accepted him completely. That basic stability unlocked his actual academic potential. He graduated high school with 3.9 GPA despite the rough semester. Got accepted to University of Washington social work program with scholarships. Graduated college. Became social worker at LGBTQ+ youth drop-in center, helping homeless teens experiencing what he'd experienced. David and Marco didn't have to help. They were a teacher and his husband, no prior relationship to Alex beyond classroom. They chose to become emergency foster parents because they both experienced family rejection when they came out and had survived and wanted to help a kid going through the same thing. That choice saved Alex from months or years of homelessness, likely prevented him from dropping out of school, gave him family when his biological family rejected him. Alex's parents said they loved him but couldn't support his lifestyle. That's not love. That's conditional acceptance requiring him to deny his identity. Real love looks like David and Marco offering their spare bedroom to a homeless student. Real family looks like adults who accept you completely as you are. Alex found that with his chosen family, not his biological one. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe LGBTQ+ youth deserve family acceptance, not homelessness. Join the conversation. Have you or LGBTQ+ family faced rejection or homelessness? What support helped? Share below. Remember, Alex wasn't troubled or failing. He was homeless because his parents rejected him for being gay. LGBTQ+ youth homelessness isn't kids' failure. It's families' failure to love unconditionally. Support LGBTQ+ youth services. Support affirming foster care. Support family acceptance programs.